Since D-Day in June 1944, the Western Allied troops had been advancing from Normandy through France and Belgium towards Germany. In the process, liberating Paris, Brussels, and Antwerp from Nazi occupation. But Nazi war propaganda portrayed a completely different picture.
Dass die Alliierten den Krieg gewinnen würden, konnte
By then, everyone knew the Allies would win the war.
Alles, was also hier
On September 11, 1944, the first U.S. divisions reached the Belgian-German border near Aachen, more than 3 months earlier than expected. Shortly afterwards, American forces further north achieved a decisive breakthrough, taking Aachen on October 21st after fierce fighting. It was the first German city to fall into Allied hands. Anti-tank obstacles were known as Dragon's Teeth. They accompanied a line of bunkers stretching over 600 kilometers. U.S. troops succeeded in breaking through the anti-tank barriers near Hürtgen. But on the other side, they met with stubborn resistance from German troops who were firmly dug in the bunkers and in the woods. Hürtgenwald. As the autumn rains began, the weather was worsening from one day to the next. The U.S. troops were literally bogged down. Plans for a second advance had to be repeatedly delayed. As one GI later said, anyone who says he knows where he'd been in the forest is lying. 5 months, the forest was the scene of successive, bitterly fought battles between the American and German armies. Although the Americans had more troops and were better equipped, their attempt to drive the Germans out of the forest was a military disaster. Progress was slow and costly as they became bogged down in the treacherous terrain.
It was a nightmare.
A first push in October 1944 ended after just 3 kilometers.
Aber es ist generell so, dass eben Panzer nicht einfach durch Wald fahren können.
Tanks can't just drive through forests and over large trees.
Bäume einfach umfahren können.
They could kill anybody.
Ich bin ja 10 Tage im...
An estimated 25,000 American and German soldiers died in the forest.
To survive the Hürtgen Forest,
The path would be easy enough to drive and walk along, that they'd be able to move the necessary troops, vehicles, heavy weapons, and other supplies along it. Everything.
Invaders retreated in panic, only for German units to cut them off down in the valley. Tanks crashed down the slopes, and many soldiers collapsed from exhaustion. A few days after the defeat, General Dwight D. Eisenhower came to the Hürtgenwald to meet his troops on the ground and assess the situation. Neither the Allied Supreme Commander nor his officers had expected so many casualties. The mood was despondent. The autumn autumn of 1944 remained unusually wet and cold, and the terrain became more and more impassable every day. The Americans' hopes for a quick victory were fading.
The days followed the same pattern. Then tanks were deployed, Sherman tanks, which advanced on a broad front. And then, of course, you could hear the shells and machine guns.
The U.S. forces were constantly getting reinforced with more men and more vehicles and equipment. But they were not prepared for the extreme weather conditions in the Eifel. The German artillery and the cold onset of winter. On December 16, 1944, 100 miles further south in the Ardennes, the Germans launched a final surprise offensive. Once again, the Allies were hard-pressed in this likewise heavily forested region and had to bring in reinforcements at short notice to stem the German advance, many from the Hürtgenwald. Managed to advance in the face of weakening German resistance. The defeat in the Ardennes counteroffensive had cost the defenders their last reserves.
And they were clean and tidy, including their uniforms, while we were a lice-ridden, dirty rebel.
The Germans tried to blow up the dams to flood the valley and halt the U.S. advance. But by now, the end of the war seemed to be fast approaching. For the German troops, the war was, in effect, already long lost. Most of the towns and villages in the Hürtgenwald were barely recognizable after the fighting. The Allied troops pushed on, and within a few weeks had conquered the Rhineland and the industrial Rur Valley as they advanced towards Berlin. The evacuated residents now hoped to be able to return to their villages. The fighting in the Hürtgen Forest was over, but the war had left a trail of destruction, a ravaged landscape whose scars are still visible today. American soldiers began clearing the mines that were buried everywhere. German prisoners of war were forced to help them. But they could only remove a small number of the deadly devices.
Is this really Düren? Sure, he said. There's the signpost. It was one big pile of rubble. You couldn't see a single building still standing.
With American troops progressing much faster than expected, supply lines were stretched, which in particular meant fuel shortages for tanks. The advance ground to a halt just behind the German border. That gave German forces time to rebuild their lines of defense. Until then, the Wehrmacht had only stationed isolated units in the northern Eifel. Meanwhile, preparations were underway for the Volkssturm, old men and boys, the home guard for Germany's last-ditch defense. In a televised address, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels called on his compatriots' determination.